I'm recording these words just a few days before the 2020 election, and the episode is going to air on November 3, the evening of the election. Now, obviously, none of us knows how things are going to turn out. But for those of you who might be watching this a month from now, or a year from now, or 5 years from now, reality may have turned out to be better or worse than all of our predictions and anxieties look today. Or we might be surprised by events that none of us ever imagined could happen. History usually works that way. But for those of you that might be watching this at some point in the future, let me explain how things appear at the end of October in 2020. The stakes feel very, very high. Let me be perfectly clear. When I say that the stakes are high, I'm not talking about tax rates or immigration rates or even infectious disease rates. Anyone with even a passing familiarity with history would have to recognize that those metrics have bounced up and down over the centuries, for better and worse, and they probably will continue to do so until the Lord Jesus comes back. And I'm not saying that they aren't important, but only that they aren't, at least where I'm sitting, where this Catholic is sitting today, the most important thing that's at stake right now. No, what concerns me most today is the shifting of the tectonic plates of our society and how that might affect the freedom of the Church. The late Cardinal Francis George, Archbishop of Chicago, said in 2014, "The ruling classes, those who shape public opinion in politics, in education, in communications, in entertainment, is using the civil law to impose its own form of morality on everyone. Those who do not conform to the official religion, we are warned, place their citizenship in danger." Will we Christians find our freedom to live and speak and act according to Scripture and reason, and as Catholics according to the apostolic teaching of our Church, increasingly constricted or even rendered illegal in some cases? Will the Catholic Church have to conform its words, its values, its practices, even its sacraments, to what appears to increasingly be a secular religion enforced by the power of the state? Yes, I'd say sitting here in November 2020, the stakes feel very high indeed. But regardless of what happens, I wanted to do this episode tonight to remind us of what we can be certain of. God will bring good out of it. God will always surprise us by working through the darkest chapters of our story to keep writing the Catholic story and advancing His kingdom. And that reminds me of something else, very profound and very frightening, but very hopeful, that the late Cardinal Francis George said in 2012. "I expect to die in bed. My successor will die in prison, and his successor will die a martyr in the public square. His successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the Church has done so often in human history." But how does God go about these periodic reformations and restorations in the Catholic story? I mean, what's the mechanism by which He brings them about? He raises up saints, and the hardest, darkest times produce the greatest saints. So for those of you who are watching this on November 3, 2020, let me remind you that tomorrow, November 4, is the feast day of St. Charles Borromeo. You know, in times far more difficult and divided than the present moment, God raised up Carlo Borromeo, who helped put the Church back on the right path. You know, we know that He can raise up leaders like that to answer the challenges of our time. But that will take tremendous courage on the part of leaders and ordinary followers like us. Because I'm reminded of something else that Cardinal George said in 2014. "Throughout history, when Catholics and other believers in revealed religion have been forced to choose between being taught by God or instructed by politicians, professors, editors of major newspapers, and entertainers, many have opted to go along with the powers that be. It takes no moral courage to conform to government and social pressure. It takes a deep faith to swim against the tide." A century ago, when enormous changes were taking place in Britain, people then, as now, advised that good citizens would go along with the flow, follow the stream of history. One of my favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton, replied this way: "A dead thing can go with the stream, only a living thing can go against it." Tomorrow, on his feast day, let's ask St. Charles Borromeo to pray for us, that we would be living things, and that he would raise up saints to lead us to follow Jesus Christ, and not just drift with the stream to whatever progress the world is promising or demanding.
I'm Greg Smith, and over the next year I'll be your guide around the world and back and forth through the ages as we discover the Catholic story and how the Church has preserved the faith once and for all given to the saints.
So, who was St. Charles Borromeo, and what can we learn from the events of his life that might give us some insights as to how to face the struggles of our own day? Let's take a walk in the woods, and I'll tell you a story. Charles Borromeo was born a count and died a cardinal. And God used him, a man of tremendous intellect and integrity, to help lead and manage the Catholic Church through the Reformation of the 16th century, something called the Counter-Reformation. And truthfully, there was a lot that needed reforming. I mean, in the truest sense of the word. I mean, the existing form of society, politically, theologically, culturally, economically, technologically, was being reformed during that time. And in the Catholic Church, it could have been reformed, almost was reformed, to be in worse shape than it was before. But partly through Borromeo's faithfulness and his courage and his hard work, the Catholic Church emerged from that time better and stronger. Now, Charles, or Carlo as he was known in Italian, was born in 1538. And he was born a nobleman in a castle, nonetheless. His father was the Count of Arona, which was an area just outside of the city of Milan in northern Italy. But his mother was a member of the famous House of Medici, the aristocratic family from Florence that was a driving force of the Renaissance and church history for 200 years. You know, the House of Medici produced 4 separate popes. So, in a way, Carlo was born into wealth and privilege. I mean, in a sense, he was born the ultimate establishment insider. Now, apparently, when he was young, he had some sort of a speech impediment that made others think at first that he was slow, but nothing could be further from the truth. His teachers quickly recognized his brilliance and his incredible work ethic and his thoroughness and attention to detail. So he was sent to the University of Pavia to study law, both civil law and canon law, or church law. But while he was studying at the university, when he was just 16 years old, his father, the Count of Arona, passed away. Now, even though Carlo wasn't the oldest son, his siblings elected him to assume leadership of the family affairs and finances because they all recognized Carlo's integrity and his legal and managerial competence, his brilliance. So he takes over the affairs of the family, but the affairs of the family, this noble family, and it's all of its estates and holdings, were very complicated, and he had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders trying to satisfy all of the members of the noble household. You know, at an age when kids today are just getting a driver's license and maybe a part-time fast food job, Carlo was studying law, training for a career in the church, and effectively the acting Count of Arona. And then things got even more complicated for Carlo. So on Christmas Day of 1559, when he was only 21 years old, his uncle, the Cardinal Giovanni Angelo de' Medici, became Pope Pius IV. So one of the first things the new Pope does is to summon his nephew to come to Rome, and he appoints him as a cardinal deacon, which is, there are 3 tiers of cardinals, cardinal bishop, cardinal priest, and cardinal deacon. It's the lowest one, and often cardinal deacons are given administrative tasks. And that's exactly where he started young Carlo, the cardinal deacon at 21 years old, doing administration of the Vatican and the Vatican Estates and the Papal Estates. So at 21 years old, this young kid, sharp as a tack, becomes a full-time advisor and assistant to the Pope. And after only a year or so, his uncle, Pope Pius IV, promoted him to the next level and made him a cardinal priest, and gave him a list of responsibilities that, frankly, would crush almost anyone, much less a 22, 23-year-old. So, for example, he was assigned to, number 1, manage the government of the Papal Estates. Number 2, supervise the Knights of Malta. Number 3, oversee the entire Franciscan and Carmelite religious orders. And number 4, found a new college in Pavia. Wow, that's a lot. A year later, he was also appointed the administrator of the Archdiocese of Milan, which at the time was the largest archdiocese in the entire Catholic Church, with over 1,000 parishes, not including religious houses and such. So even at this point, young Cardinal Borromeo was smart enough to do what smart people do, which is to surround themselves with other smart and talented people. So he founded a literary academy inside the walls of the Vatican, and he brought scholars and leaders and churchmen, bright churchmen and artists and all these kinds of folks together every evening to read new books, to give lectures, to discuss ideas. And he compiled all of the lessons that he learned from these evenings into a book he called Noctes Vaticanae, or Vatican Nights. It's an incredible insight into, sort of what the intelligentsia, the best and brightest inside the walls of the Vatican, were thinking during the Counter-Reformation. Now, what's really ironic, or at least interesting, probably ironic too, is that up until this point, Carlo had not been ordained a priest. It wasn't a requirement for becoming a cardinal at the time, but with all of these responsibilities, he genuinely felt a vocation that God was calling him to the priesthood. So he went through the process. He certainly already had the education, but he went through the process, becoming first a deacon and a few months later becoming a priest. But only a few months after his ordination, his uncle, the Pope, appointed him to be the Bishop of Milan. Can you imagine that? He had been functioning already as the diocesan administrator of the Diocese of Milan, and he'd been doing that remotely from the Vatican in Rome. But only a few months after his ordination, his uncle appoints him to become the bishop, and which was, as I said, the largest diocese in the entire Catholic Church. But right around this time, within a couple of months of that, so he's 24 years old, he faces this tremendous fork in the road of his life, his career. So what happened is his older brother died. So even though Carlo had been functioning as basically the business manager for the noble house of Arona, his brother held the title of Count of Arona. Now, with his brother dead, there was no one to preserve the noble house's name, nobody to pass it on to. So the rest of the family begs Carlo to leave the church and get married so that he can produce an heir and carry on the family name and preserve the estates and holdings. But Carlo refused. At this critical juncture in his life, he realized that God was calling him to become a good bishop and to model for other priests and bishops what dedication and faithfulness and holiness looks like. And he felt to abandon that, to then go into the lay state and marry and retain his noble title and produce children for that, would be modeling abandonment of the church for the things of the world. And so he refused. He decides to stay as the Bishop of Milan and serve the church as the church needs him in holiness. Now, as we said a minute ago, Milan was the largest diocese in the Catholic Church, 1,000 parishes and hundreds of priests and religious. But it was also rife with corruption. From top to bottom. There was corruption of money, corruption of morals, corruption of offices, corruption of doctrine. The corruption was bad enough under normal times, but it was a special problem in Milan because of geography and current events. So if you look at a map of Italy, you'll notice that Milan is in the north. It's up near close to the Dolomites, the border between Italy and Switzerland and Germany. And so it's heavily influenced, even to this day, Milan and the region around it, by German culture, German peoples. It trades with Germany. It's a short drive over the border. And so that German influence was part of the reason why the corruption in Milan was a huge problem. Because what was going on in Germany, of course, at the time, was the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther had launched the Reformation a generation or so earlier in Germany. It was sweeping through. In fact, it was tearing up Germany. The peasants' revolt, the wars, the politics, and it was sweeping like wildfire through the German countries and Switzerland, for a variety of reasons. Some of them religious, some of them political, some of them economic. And so the corruption in Milan, the large diocese essentially on the German border, gave fuel to the fire. I mean, it was like throwing gasoline on a bonfire. It was incentivizing people to abandon the Catholic Church for the Lutheran churches. I mean, people would listen to Luther, they would listen to the Reformation pastors as they went on and on about the corruption of the Catholic Church, and then they would simply point to this massive diocese of Milan right there and say, see, that's what Luther's talking about. So Bishop Borromeo shows up in Milan. He's 25 years old, aristocratic, educated, connected, sharp as a tack, talented manager, administrator. But most of all, he's holy in his heart and in his relationship with God and in his life. And he's dedicated to restoring the integrity of the Catholic Church so that it could really be true and good and beautiful. And that was his sense of vocation, a sense of mission. But how to do that in the circumstances he's under, how to address that in Milan and, of course, in the larger church in general, but particularly in this massive corrupt diocese. Well, he's a clever guy. So he comes up with a 3-point plan. First, he realized that the best defense against the doctrinal errors of the Protestants and to restore the integrity of the clergy was education, doctrinal education, catechesis. You see, at the time, too many clergy were actually ignorant of the faith. They were uneducated. Most had received some minimal kind of on-the-job training in how to perform the liturgy and the sacraments, but most had no actual biblical or theological or moral or doctrinal understanding or formation. So Bishop Borromeo started founding schools and colleges and seminaries to teach and train on the basis of sound doctrine, future priests, clergy, religious, and lay people. And that emphasis on catechesis and education begins to give a basis for not only theological reform, moral reform, ecclesiastical practice reform, and start cleaning up the church. I mean, all of a sudden now you had people being taught what the standards are and what the correct teaching of the church is, and then being asked to, adhere their lives and their practices and their teachings to that. So his emphasis on education and catechism and seminary formation is so critical. It's one of the reasons why he's the patron saint of not only bishops but catechists. The second plank of his plan for reform was to root out corrupt clergy and corrupt religious wherever he found them, and to force them to either reform or be replaced. And as you can imagine, that made him very unpopular with the establishment. So, like every corrupt establishment culture and bureaucracy since the dawn of time, there were a lot of people that were benefiting and deeply invested in the status quo and wanting to keep the status quo, the status quo. I mean, clergy were making money selling influence and favors. Wealthy lay people and the secular government liked being able to buy control of powerful church institutions. And none of them liked this young, idealistic Bishop Borromeo coming in and, messing up their business model. So, for example, there were corrupt monasteries in the area around Milan. And, you understand the way that monasteries worked in those days, most of the Middle Ages, is that they had vast land holdings, and it was the rents from those land holdings that supported the monastery and its works. So there were these these monasteries with these massive land holdings, and they were constantly doing deals with the secular government and corrupt businessmen and other leaders to sort of bleed out the poor folks that paid rent on their lands. And so Carlo confronted them. And twice they actually tried to assassinate him. I mean, they tried to shoot him. They did shoot him with pistols. Once, there was a corrupt monastery, a corrupt brotherhood called the Brotherhood of the Humiliati, kind of ironically named. And they were so rife with not only corruption, but the occult and all kinds of other things that Bishop Borromeo showed up and banged on the door of the monastery, demanding to be let in so that he could actually, deal with the problem and exorcise and reconsecrate it. And one of them reached through the gate with a pistol and shot the bishop. It sort of ricocheted off him and hit the bishop's cross staff that he was carrying. Another time, he was saying mass in a chapel, and a corrupt monk, part of a corrupt monastery and brotherhood he was trying to clean up, came into the chapel dressed as a layperson, and he was standing right behind Bishop Borromeo in the seats. And at a critical moment in the mass, he pulls out a pistol and he shoots the bishop in the back. The bishop falls down. He thinks people think he's dead. He actually, says, you better give me last rites. But when they peeled it away, all of his vestments had sort of deadened the bullet. He had kind of a bad bruise and a wound, but it wasn't fatal. And this is the kind of opposition that he had. I mean, we talk today about, the deep state opposing change. I mean, there was a deep state that opposed any kind of change that Bishop Borromeo tried to put into place, and they would stop at nothing up to and including shooting him to prevent him, from upturning or overturning their apple carts. Now, if you're facing this kind of opposition, a lot of leaders might back off, but not Bishop Borromeo. I mean, it actually only emboldened him to press on and press harder to fix what was broken in the Diocese of Milan. He also had to deal with the occult. So members of the laity and clergy were actually dabbling in or openly practicing witchcraft and sorcery in Milan and just over the border in Switzerland. And so Bishop Borromeo would not tolerate it, and he dealt with it very severely. Modern people criticize the fact that he dealt with some of that very seriously, but a lot of that was very consistent with the times. I mean, there really were practices of witchcraft and occult and sorcery taking place in the church, and according to the laws of the day, he pressed for sentences for those people, and some of them were executed. But he rooted out that kind of corruption that was poisoning the church, not only the clergy, but the lives of the lay people who followed the clergy. Now, the third plank of his plan to reform Milan was for the church to begin to legitimately serve the poor and care for the sick once again. The most famous bishop of Milan prior to Borromeo was, of course, Ambrose the Great, who was the church leader, church father who essentially converted or shepherded St. Augustine to the faith like 1100 years earlier. So what he wanted to do was reclaim the integrity and the truth and goodness and beauty of the Diocese of Milan by being the church, serving the poor, serving the sick, emptying himself out and emptying out the church to do whatever it took to be Christ to the people. So, for example, one year while he was bishop, there was a crop failure in the northern Italian region, around all of Italy actually, that led to severe famine. People were literally starving in the streets in Milan. So Bishop Borromeo took it upon himself to feed the poor, out of his own pocket if necessary. He nearly bankrupted his family's funds, and he borrowed enormous sums of money by the archdiocese that had to be paid back, and created, hardships to the diocese. But, he didn't regret it, because he was feeding up to 70,000 people a day for months through that winter of starvation. He felt it was what the church had to do. Another year, there was an outbreak of plague. People were dying in the streets, and the hospitals and hospices were packed with the sick. The mayor, secular leaders, all of the wealthy people fled town to their country estates, and the clergy refused to visit the sick. So Bishop Borromeo himself went from hospital to hospice to sick house to home, comforting and giving people the sacraments, until the clergy, ashamed by his example, began to follow his example, and the mayor and the influential folks returned because the people said, the bishop loves us, why don't they? So he models this shepherding, and he shows what a good bishop does. You know, and again, I think so much of the irony is, here's this guy who, you know, by his birth, his training, his skill set, you know, you might think he's just this establishment insider, just this guy who knows how to administrate and operate at the top. But what he really does is he pours himself out, and that way he becomes, you know, sort of a model or an example of Jesus Christ, who, you know, as we read in Philippians chapter 2, even though he was born in the very nature of God, pours himself out for others. And Bishop Borromeo, this establishment insider, this influential nobleman, this you know, superstar in the Catholic Church, this amazing administrator, doesn't hesitate to pour himself out in every way he can for the people. And I think that's just astounding, and it's one of the reasons why, you know, we celebrate him, and one of the reasons why, you know, in this episode, I think it's so important for us to look at his example, you know, during the times that we're facing, when we're looking for leaders who will care about the people, who will care about outcomes and have integrity. But in the end, all of this added up. I mean, all of the responsibilities, the service, the pouring himself out for others, it all took a toll on his health. I mean, he was physically spent by the time he was middle-aged. When he was 46 years old, he contracted a fever and died. Of course, considering that he started his career at 16, he'd accomplished more by 46 than most people do in a life that's twice as long. Well, now let's hear the story behind the saint.
If all Cardinal Charles Borromeo had ever done was just to be a good and faithful bishop in the Diocese of Milan, then he would have been a saint worth emulating and venerating. But behind his story, there's a bigger story. It's the story of the Counter-Reformation in the Catholic Church. And Charles Borromeo was one of the prime movers of the Counter-Reformation, and he deserved a lot of the credit for its accomplishments. Now, as the name suggests, the Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's response to the Protestant Reformation, which occurred about 500 years ago. So to understand it, we need to start with the problem of the Protestant Reformation and the problems that precipitated it. Now, the Protestant Reformation was launched in Wittenberg, Germany on October 31, All Hallows Eve or Halloween, in 1517. Now, on that day, a young Augustinian monk and theology professor named Martin Luther nailed a list of 95 complaints against the Catholic Church onto the front door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Now, his complaints, they struck a nerve. I mean, a lot of people were frustrated with the condition of the church at the moment, and for a variety of reasons. But Luther, he articulated that frustration with his list in ways, about the church's doctrine, the laxity of the church's doctrines and morals, and the ways that they'd become corrupted. And he articulated them in a very powerful and succinct way. I mean, he was the right guy at the right place at the right time, with exactly the right message. And the recent development of the printing press and mass commercial printing made it also the right moment, because his ideas spread across Europe, virally. I mean, it was like a snowball gaining speed and becoming an avalanche. And as those ideas gained traction and momentum and weight because of how various leaders responded, So the Pope at the time was a very unserious man, didn't take much of anything very seriously, including most aspects of his job. And so he didn't take Luther's complaints very seriously either, which just threw gasoline on the fire of all the people who thought Luther was making some valid points. You know, it's one of those unanswerable mysteries of history. If the Pope at the time had responded promptly and appropriately to Luther and had made, some appropriate adjustments or reforms in the Catholic Church, would the Protestant Reformation have been sort of nipped in the bud? But he didn't. And so while the Pope was holding parties in Rome and ignoring the points that Luther was making and the message that was spreading so violently and quickly over the Alps in Germany, German leaders over the Alps, and then English leaders and English noblemen and a lot of political leaders in Europe began to see Luther's movement as a sort of opportunity, perfect opportunity to justify something that they already wanted to do, which was seize church lands and cease to pay taxes to Rome and so in just a few years, Martin Luther's list of complaints, while being ignored in Rome and being seized on by political leaders in other parts of Europe, began to gain weight and they began speed and like I said, like a snowball turning into an avalanche, and the Catholic Church begins breaking up all over Europe, fracturing as the revolution sort of spreads from Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, England, and so on and so forth. Well, eventually, the popes and cardinals realized that they, have a genuine crisis on their hands, and to understand how they responded with what we're calling the Counter-Reformation, what was called the Counter-Reformation, we have to understand the problems, the specific problems that Luther identified, what his 95 complaints were, and how the Catholic Church eventually got around to fixing those. This is a Rubik's Cube. Now, it was a popular puzzle, 20, 30 years ago. It has 6 sides, obviously, as a cube, and with 6 different colors. But then you scramble up all the tiles, so all the colors are misaligned. And the challenge is to get them realigned, so you have one color on each of the 6 sides. But it's really, really hard, because when you start trying to get all the red on one side, for example, you mess up the other sides. You think you're going to move it here, and then it moves something else over there, and the jumble just keeps getting worse. It takes a sharp mind to see what's going on in the cube and to look sort of several moves ahead on the cube and to sort of anticipate and line things up so you get it all, aligned perfectly. And I think that in some ways the Rubik's Cube can be a metaphor for the Protestant Reformation. So in 1517, most people could agree that the church was out of alignment, like the cube being all jumbled up. If we think of the sides of the cube as representing sort of facets or dimensions of the church, like one color represents the church's practices, and another color represents the church's doctrine, and another color represents the church's leadership, and another color is the church's relationship with civil government or whatever. Well, those colors, like the Rubik's Cube, were all jumbled up and out of alignment. The practices of the church weren't lined up properly with its theology, with its doctrine, with its clergy was mispositioned with the civil government, and so on and so forth. Now, for most of my Christian life, I was a Protestant, and I don't mind saying still to my friends and former Protestant colleagues that in many ways the church in Luther's time was jumbled up like this cube. So, Luther nailed his 95 complaints to the door in 1517. If you had been in Rome and or in the church in Germany in, the year 1500, 1510, 1516, 1517, what he was identifying were he was making some valid points. He was identifying some things that really were out of whack. But the question was not, are things out of whack? I think everybody could look and see that things were, misaligned or jumbled up. The question was what to do about it, how to solve the cube and how to put the cube back in its proper order. And I think, and my Protestant friends and colleagues, this is where we would have to agree to disagree. I think what Luther and the Protestants did, in my opinion, was to start twisting the cube around to get the practices of the church all lined up, and then they ended up messing up the doctrine. So in other words, I think that the Protestant doctrines were generated because Luther, and particularly Luther, was trying to change church practices. And in order to change church practices and get those sort of lined up like all the blue tiles on one side of the cube, he ended up having to adjust doctrine and theology. And it ended up messing everything else up. So in many cases, the reformers get the theology and doctrine understanding of the church all jumbled up worse than it was prior to that. What they wanted to do were fix abuses, and they ended up, in many cases, messing the thing up so badly that it was easier just to toss the whole cube in the trash and start over again and break with the Catholic Church. But in the end, it took men like Cardinal Charles Borromeo to solve the cube. I mean, to address all the various dimensions of the church and the facets of the church and get them lined up properly. You know, that's what had happened 300 years earlier. So St. Francis of Assisi, 300 years earlier in Italy, had looked at the church and he'd seen the same sort of jumble. The church's practices and doctrines and leadership were all misaligned. But St. Francis worked within the church to solve the cube. Now, over the following 3 centuries between Francis of Assisi and Martin Luther, the church had, in a sense, the cube had gotten jumbled up again. You know, the Franciscan Revolution of the 1200s, in a sense, healed the church or realigned the church. The Protestant Reformation, beginning with Luther, just tossed it all out. And it was, you know, Charles Borromeo and other holy and brave and clever Catholic leaders, it took them working diligently over quite a while, over several years and decades, to sort of solve the cube and put the church back together again and back in order. And that process of sort of lining the cube up properly so all the colors are on the right sides once again, that was the Counter-Reformation. So Luther and the Protestants' response to the abuses of the church, to the cube being jumbled, is to toss it out. What Counter-Reformation leaders like Charles Borromeo or Ignatius Loyola do, they refuse to toss out the Catholic Church onto the dustbin of history. And what they were determined to do was to solve the cube, solve the problems by addressing and correcting the errors so that all the facets of the church would be properly aligned again. And that meant putting some mechanisms in place. So what were some of those mechanisms and things that they did? Well, one formal way that they addressed the abuses and the problems in the church was the Council of Trent. Now, Trent was a council that was held over the spans of 3 successive popes. It took, I think, 18 years, started in 1545. So Charles Borromeo was 7 years old when it began, but again, it went on for 18 years. And his role in it was that by the time he was working for his uncle, Pope Pius IV, one of the duties his uncle assigns him is to go up there and basically be the administrator and secretary to get the council completed. It had been dragging on for almost 18 years. It was unable to sort of produce the final report. So Carlo goes up there, young Cardinal Borromeo in his 20s, and he shepherds that council to its conclusion and gets it to write its final document. And the final documents of the Council of Trent simply go through a lot of the doctrines of the church and organizing around sort of the scriptures and sacramental doctrines, and then emphasizes the proper position of the Catholic Church on the doctrine, and then from the doctrine addresses the practice. And see, that's the opposite of what kind of Luther had done. Luther, in objecting to the practices, had changed doctrines. What Charles Borromeo and the Fathers of Trent do is they correct the doctrines and then from right doctrine align the practices. So that's kind of how they solve the cube. And the final documents of Trent go through what is the proper role of the scriptures in the life of the church, what is our understanding of original sin, how are we justified by the saving work of Christ. It walks through the sacraments. It walks through baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, confession, all 7 of the sacraments. It emphasizes those. confession, last rites, matrimony. It lays out the 7 sacraments and uses those as an organizing template to understand not only what the church teaches, but how the church ought to practice itself in the life of Christians. And then it addresses things like saints and relics and indulgences and iconography and whatnot. And what it produces is really, in the end, the core of Catholicism. It recaptures, the Catholic faith and articulates it in a very powerful way. And it's the Catholic faith that we know today. In addition to Charles Borromeo, one of the other principal leaders of the Counter-Reformation was Ignatius Loyola, who founds the Jesuits. And he founds the Jesuits precisely to kind of end corruption of the church, return the church to its mission. And in the early founding of the Jesuits was, missionary. How are we going to spread the gospel? And in some previous episodes of One Rolling Adventure, I've talked a lot about the Jesuit missionaries to Japan and China and places like that. And Francis Xavier and Matteo Ricci in China. And so, the Jesuits, the reform of the papacy was another big emphasis of the Counter-Reformation. The Renaissance popes, there had been a lot of abuses. All of that kind of gets cleaned up, and the papacy emerges stronger than ever. The church also works with European leaders to defend Christendom. At the time, in the middle 1500s, you had the expansion of Islam was trying to once again press into the center of Europe and actually take the Italian peninsula. And so the Pope organizes the Holy League to fight that off. And the epic Battle of Lepanto in 1571, the great naval battle, is a Counter-Reformation accomplishment. When I think about the Counter-Reformation, one of the things that, always strikes me is a book I read a number of years ago that made the point that in the Counter-Reformation, one of the things that one of the popes had unleashed was his secret weapon. And his secret weapon was Michelangelo. And in the Sistine Chapel, a lot of us are familiar with the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, but the altar wall in the Sistine Chapel is the Last Judgment of Christ. And Michelangelo is commissioned at the end of his life as a sort of Counter-Reformation statement to Luther and the Reformers to sort of paint the Catholic vision of the end and the role of Christ and the role of the saints and the role of Mary and what judgment is. And it's just, we'll have to do another episode about that. But it just, powerful statements. The Catholic Church finds its voice and it finds its center again. It finds its heart. And it's reformed in very powerful ways. So I began this episode by speaking to you about how it's airing on, the episode is airing on election night of 2020. And the significance of that is that the day after the election, so November 4, is the feast day of St. Charles Borromeo. And, I felt it was really appropriate for us to have this episode the day before his feast day. Whatever happens in the election of 2020, we're going to wake up and remember that hard times make great saints, and God can raise up men like St. Charles Borromeo, men with vision and courage and fortitude, willing to reform systems, willing to take on corrupt establishments, willing to return the church to its glory, willing to put things right again to sort of solve the cube. So tomorrow, on November 4, and every November 4 after this, whatever happens, let's ask St. Charles Borromeo to pray for us, that we would have vision and fortitude and courage to press on, to take on whatever God sends us, and to believe that we can solve the cube and make things better. And now you know the story behind the saint.